The night was dark, as if the sky itself had decided to hide from what was happening. The rain, like a silent witness, pounded the roofs, washing the deserted streets. Somewhere in the distance, in the shadow of a dim lantern, voices were heard, rough and cold, and then a sharp metallic sound that pierced the silence like a scream. She lay on the wet pavement, clutching her arm, which was throbbing with pain. Her eyes were wide with shock. Her breathing was ragged. The girl tried to rise, but her body did not obey. The prosthesis that had always supported her now seemed useless, like dead weight. There were two men standing in front of her, their faces hidden by the peaks of their caps, but their cold gazes piercing her to the bone. One of them held a hammer, gleaming in the light of the lantern, and she knew that this tool was not intended for repair, but for intimidation. "You shouldn't be here," one of them said, his voice ringing out in the cold air. It was even, almost calm, but beneath that apparent restraint lay hatred. "People like you have no right to be on our streets." Her heart was beating so hard that it seemed like the whole world could hear it. She looked up, meeting his gaze. There was nothing human in those cold eyes, only a desire to suppress, to destroy, to erase her existence. I was just walking home." Her voice was weak, trembling, but even in this weakness there was desperation, an attempt to protect herself, like a rabbit before the jaws of a predator. "Oh," the second officer chuckled, his laugh as dry as the creak of a rusty door. "People like you don't have a home." The words hit her like a hammer. She felt a wave of fear rise in her chest, but behind it came something else, anger. She knew they didn't see her as a person. To them, she was nothing, just a shadow to be crushed. "Get up," the first one ordered, his voice colder. He took a step closer, his boots splashing loudly in the water. "Or I'll do it again." Her gaze slid to the hammer, to the thing that had left a crimson mark of pain on her arm just seconds ago. She tried to rise, but the prosthetic slipped on the wet ground, and she collapsed again. "Useless," he muttered, and his words sounded louder than any gunshot. Her fingers curled into a fist, and she felt her nails digging into her palm. She knew she couldn't just stay here, but what could she do? Alone, black, with a prosthetic leg, against a man in uniform whose power was their weapon. And yet, something sparked inside her, a memory, something her father had said to her when she was little. "You are stronger than they think. Never let them take your dignity away from you." I'm human," she said, her voice shaking but firm. The officers stopped, their faces distorted with contempt. "A man," the first one stepped closer, his silhouette obscured by the light of the lantern. "You are not a man. You are nothing." Those words were the last straw. She knew her chances were slim, but she couldn't let them speak for her anymore. She raised her head, her eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them anymore, only defiance. And that silence, that moment when the world stood still, was the beginning of something greater than she could have ever imagined. The silence of the street was deceptive, like the calm before a storm. The girl Saturday on the wet asphalt, her hand shaking from the pain left by the blow of the hammer. Drops of rain ran down her face, mixing with tears, but she tried not to lower her gaze. In front of her stood the policemen, giants in their uniforms, their figures blocking the light of the lantern, leaving her in the shadow of their disdain. "Look at her," one of them sneered, his voice sounding as if he were addressing an animal rather than a human. "Think she can't argue with the law?" "The law," the second laughed, and there was an icy mockery in his laughter. "She hasn't even grown up to the law. For people like her, the law is a luxury." The words hit her hard, as if they had struck not her body but her soul. She knew that for them, she was not just a stranger. She was a problem. The color of her skin, her disability, her courage, all of this made them want to crush her. "I didn't do anything," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice from shaking. She felt anger and despair flaring up inside her. "Nothing." The first officer leaned closer, his face so close she could smell tobacco and rain. "You're just here, and it's too much." His words sounded like an indictment. Her heart began to pound and her breathing became heavy. She wanted to stand up, but she knew that would be perceived as a challenge. "People like you always think they can get away with anything," the second added, his words full of venom. "You sit on the system's neck, and then you demand equality." "I just wanted to get home," she said, her voice almost a whisper, but there was bitterness in it. "Oh," the first officers laughed again, louder this time. "Your home is somewhere out there, in the ghetto, where you belong. Don't you dare talk to me about home." The words cut through her like an icy knife. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her skin, but she didn't let herself cry. They were waiting for this. They wanted to see her broken. You look at us like we owe you something, he continued, taking a step closer. His boots left dirty marks on the wet asphalt next to her foot. But no one, do you hear me? No one will protect you. Her eyes met his for a moment. It was the look of a man who reveled in his power. He wanted her to feel worthless, and he seemed to believe he had succeeded. Do you even have someone? The second officer asked, leaning closer. Or is your daddy as useless as you are? These words were the last straw. She felt the anger inside her become an uncontrollable flame. My father is better than any of you, she said, her voice loud and firm. The policemen frowned, their faces distorted with surprise and anger. What did you say? The first one stepped forward, his voice lower and threateningly quiet. Repeat that. You heard me, she replied, her gaze becoming firm and her voice no longer trembling. There was a moment of silence. Only the sound of the rain broke the ominous pause. The policeman standing closer raised his hand, as if he was going to hit again. But the other stopped him. Not now, he hissed. Her place is not here. We can take her home. The words sounded like a threat. The girl knew she needed to find a way out, but there was no one around to help. She felt small and vulnerable, but inside her, there was a feeling that she shouldn't give up. You regret speaking, said the first officer, straightening up. His face had become a mask of superiority again. People like you always regret. They left her on the asphalt, her body shaking from pain and cold, but she did not allow herself to be discouraged. Their words continued to echo in her head, but with them, her determination grew. She knew this was not the end. Her fight had only just begun. The rain seemed to be getting heavier, as if the heavens were trying to wash away the filth of what was happening on the ground. But not a single drop could erase the brutality and hatred that rained down on the girl. She stood, trying to keep her balance on the wet pavement, her prosthetic slipping, her arm throbbing with pain. In front of her, the two police officers surrounded her like predators, their words like sharp claws digging into her soul. Look at you, one of them said, his voice low and mocking. You can't even stand up straight. How do you even live with this? Her heart sank, but she didn't give herself the right to show it. She knew they wanted to see fear, to see her humiliated, but she couldn't let them win. I don't need your comment, she said, her voice quiet but bitter. Oh, look, the second officer sneered, his face twisted in contempt. She thinks she has the right to speak. People like you should be grateful that we allow you to walk our streets at all. She felt her legs shaking, but not from the cold. It was a mixture of anger and pain. She knew her words couldn't change them, but she couldn't stay silent either. I have the same rights as you, she said, her voice louder than she expected. These words made them freeze for a moment. Their faces expressed surprise, and then anger. Rights? The first officer stepped closer, his boots squelching loudly as they stepped into the puddle next to her foot. Your rights are what we give you, and if you must know, people like you don't deserve anything, especially people like you. The other added, his eyes sliding down to her prosthetic. You're a mistake of nature, and I'm sure that somewhere up there, someone already regrets letting you into this world. These words were like a blow. They touched the deepest, most vulnerable place in her soul, but she clenched her teeth, not allowing the tears to treacherously roll down her cheeks. You think you're better than me because you wear a uniform, she blurted out, her voice breaking with emotion. The policeman laughed. It was a loud, rude laugh, full of contempt and malice. Better. The first officer stepped closer, his face inches from hers. I'm better than you simply by the fact of who I am. White, strong, normal. And you can't even stand without that piece of metal on your leg. He poked his finger into her prosthetic, and the movement made her instinctively retreat. Look at her. The other pointed at her hands, clutching the straps of her backpack so tightly that her fingers were white. She doesn't even understand that all this is useless. No one will come to protect her. No one will stand by her side. You should be grateful we didn't detain you, the first added, his voice quieter but even more menacing. Although maybe we should have. Who knows what you're hiding in that backpack of yours? She felt her breathing become ragged. Her fingers loosened, and her backpack fell to the wet asphalt. There's nothing there, she said, her voice hoarse but firm. We'll decide that, said the second, bending down and roughly grabbing the backpack. They began to rummage through her things, throwing them into the puddles. Notebooks, textbooks, A photograph of her family. All of it became part of the mud they walked through. One of them picked up the photograph, his face twisted into a grin. "Is this your family?" he asked, holding the picture up for her to see. "I bet they're just like you. Worthless, useless." She clenched her fists, feeling the anger growing inside her. "Get out," she breathed, her voice full of pain and anger. "What did you say?" The first officer raised his head, his face red with rage. "You dared." He stepped forward, his hand raised, but at that moment his radio rang. A gruff voice, on the other end of the line, ordered them to return to the station. The officers frowned, their faces expressing disappointment. "You're lucky today," the first one said, throwing the backpack back on the ground. "But remember, your luck is not endless." They turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the rainy darkness among her wet things. Her hands were still shaking, but she picked up her backpack, carefully gathering the photographs and books. Her heart was pounding, her body was exhausted, but a new feeling had flared up in her soul. It wasn't just pain, it was determination. She couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. This evening was the beginning of something bigger, and even if the world was against her, she was ready to fight. The night grew even darker, as if nature itself had decided to hide the street from prying eyes. The girl was on her knees, gathering her wet things, her trembling hands trying to save from the mud at least what could be saved. The backpack was heavy with water, its straps torn, but she continued to pick up books. No books, even a dirty photograph. In that picture, the faces of her family were blurred, as if the rain was trying to erase her past. Every movement was painful. Her arm, still throbbing from the hammer blow, was a silent reminder of how fragile she was in this world where her body, her skin color, her life were challenges in themselves. She wanted to leave, to disappear, but her feet were rooted to the ground. She heard footsteps behind her. They were slow, confident, heavy. She didn't look back. Her heart was pounding so loudly that it drowned out the sound of the rain. "You're still here." The first policeman's voice cut through the silence again. His tone was as if he was surprised. She hadn't vanished like a ghost. She clutched the things in her hands, her gaze still directed downward. She knew they had come back for a reason. Their anger, their contempt, all of it needed an outlet. "Do you really think you can just leave?" The second added, his voice quieter, but even more threatening. "Don't you understand who's in charge here?" She slowly raised her head, her face wet from rain and tears, but there was steel in her eyes. "I didn't do anything," she said, her voice weak but true. "Nothing." The first cop stepped closer, his boots squelching loudly as they stepped into a puddle. "You think just being here isn't enough? You're the problem. You and your kind bring dirt with you." The words hit her like a blow. She knew they hated her for the color of her skin, for daring to resist, for existing. "If it weren't for people like you, the city would be cleaner," he continued, his voice even, almost friendly, which made his words even more poisonous. She felt anger growing inside her, mixed with helplessness. "Tell me," his tone became even quieter, but no less threatening. "Have you ever wondered why no one wants to see you here? Why you always seem out of place?" Her breathing became ragged. She looked at him, her gaze full of hatred, but she could not say anything. So you're silent?" He grinned, his eyes flashing in the light of the lantern. "Of course. What can you say? All you know how to do is complain." "Enough," she said, her voice weak but threatening. "What did you say?" The second policeman stepped forward, his face contorted with anger. "Enough," she repeated, her voice louder, firmer. "You dare tell me enough?" His voice rose. He grabbed her shoulder, pushing her back roughly. She fell, her back hitting the wet ground, but she didn't scream. Her eyes, wide open, looked straight at him. "You must know your place," he hissed, his face so close she could feel his breath. "And your place is where we say it is." In that moment, something inside her broke. Not her spirit, not her resolve, but her fear. She couldn't feel it anymore. All that was left was anger. "My place is not under your boots," she said, her voice low but full of fury. His face contorted with surprise, then with anger. He raised his hand, but the second officer stopped him. "Enough," he said. "We've already shown her who's boss." "No, she hasn't understood yet," the first one answered, his eyes burning with hatred. But at that moment, a siren sounded behind them. Both policemen frowned, their faces turned pale. "This is not the end," the first one hissed. "Retreating, we will see each other again." They turned and walked away, their footsteps fading into the rainy silence. The girl remained on the ground, her body shaking, but not from the cold. She knew this was not the end, but she also knew she would not remain silent any longer. The rain wasn't just rain anymore. It was becoming a wall that cut them off from the rest of the world, as if these streets belonged only to them. The girl stood on the sidewalk, soaking wet, her arms still aching with pain, and her prosthetic began to slip on the wet ground. She looked ahead, but her gaze was frowning somewhere in the void. She knew this wasn't the end. The police steps sounded behind her again, and her heart sank in her chest. "Do you really think you can just walk away?" The first officer's voice was rough, but there was more anger in it than mockery now. He was coming closer, his silhouette blocking the light of the lantern. "No one walks away from us without consequences like you." Her hands were shaking, but she didn't let herself turn around. She knew that looking at him would only make him angrier. "You pretend to be brave," he continued, his voice growing lower, more menacing, "but I can see you're afraid. I can see it in your eyes. You know no one here can help you." She clenched her teeth, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't show weakness, but inside her, fear screamed. "Why are you silent?" The second officer walked around her on the other side, his face almost invisible in the shadows. "Do you think that if you remain silent, it will all end? No, this is only the beginning. We will make you understand who is in charge here. You're just one of them." The first one continued, his words like poison, slowly spreading through her soul. "You think you can live among us as an equal, but the truth is, you'll never be an equal, never." She felt her eyes filling with tears, but she forced herself to hold them back. Tears were what they wanted. They wanted to see her broken, humiliated, crushed under the weight of their words. "You know what's funny?" The second officer stepped closer, his boots squelching loudly in the puddle. "We're not doing this because you did anything. We're doing this because we can." The words hit her like a blow. She knew it. She knew that their actions weren't personal. They were part of a system that had always been against people like her. "I didn't do anything to you." Her voice was hoarse but firm. "I did." The first officer stopped right in front of her. His face was so close, she could see the rain dripping off his visor. "You just exist. That's enough." Her breathing became ragged. She wanted to leave, to disappear, but her feet were chained to the ground. "You should have left," he continued, his voice growing louder. "But instead, you stand here like you have some kind of right, like you think you can be one of us." His words were full of hatred, and each of them was like a blow. She wanted to scream, to answer, but she knew that would only make the situation worse. "People like you always think they mean something," the second added, his voice as cold as ice. "But the truth is, you're nobody, and no one's coming to help you." The words stuck in her head. No one was coming. It was true. No one was around. These streets were theirs, and in that moment, they were making sure she knew it. "Take off your hood," the first officer ordered sharply. She frowned, her hands shaking. "I said take off the hood," he repeated, his voice low but menacing. She slowly raised her hands to push the hood back, her wet hair sticking to her skin, but she could feel their eyes boring into her. "Of course," the first one grinned, seeing her face. "Black, who would have doubted it?" His words were filled with such contempt that she felt something inside her break. "You know what's the worst thing about you?" he continued, leaning closer. "It's that you think you deserve something more. But the truth is, you'll always be where you belong, on your knees." Her gaze lifted, and she looked straight into his eyes. In that moment, her fear disappeared. In its place, only determination remained. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said, her voice even and confident. His face contorted with anger, but it didn't have time to respond. A siren sounded behind them. Both officers turned, their bodies tensing. "We're not finished yet," the first one hissed, but his voice trembled. They walked away, their footsteps fading into the darkness. She stood there, her body shaking, but not from the cold. It was a mixture of pain, anger, and a faint but new sense of hope. She knew this wasn't the end, but the beginning of something greater. She wouldn't give up, not now, not ever. The rain was no longer just weather. It was now a curtain, hiding their world from prying eyes. The girl stood motionless, like a frowning statue, staring at the empty street before her. Her wet hair was stuck to her face, and her body was shaking from the cold and pain, but her eyes burned with a strange mixture of anger and determination. The officers' footsteps were getting closer, and she knew they were back. "We warned you," one of them said, his voice low and level, like a teacher giving a lecture. "You shouldn't have stood here." She turned slowly to meet their gaze. They were surrounding her again, like wolves waiting for their moment to pounce. But something in their movements had changed. They were more wary now, their eyes scanning the streets as if they were searching for someone. "You understand that this place is not for people like you," the second one continued, his voice a little louder, but there was a sense of nervousness in it. "You will always be an outsider here." Her heart sank, but she didn't let it show. She saw the emotions in their eyes change, from anger to something more complex doubt. They were afraid of something, but what? "You're afraid," she said, her voice evened with an underlying threat. The first officer stopped, his eyes narrowed. "What should I be afraid of, you?" He laughed, but his laugh was forced, as if he was trying to convince himself that it was true. "Not me." She took a step forward, her wet boots splashing loudly in a puddle. "But you're afraid. It's obvious." Her words stung him. He stepped closer, his face contorted with anger. "You think you can talk to me like that? You think your insolence means anything?" He grabbed her hand. His grip was strong, but she didn't flinch. "You are nothing. You always were nothing, and you always will be nothing." But at that moment she smiled. It was a weak but unwavering smile that caught him off guard. "You're so sure that no one can see what you're doing," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "But you're wrong." The second officer's frowned, his eyes scanning the street nervously. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low and tense. She raised her hand, and they saw the phone she was holding. Her fingers were tightly wrapped around the device. The screen was wet from the rain, but there was a red recording light on it. "Everything you said, everything you did, it's all written down," she said, her voice as hard as steel. The first officer snatched the phone from her hands, but his fingers were shaking. He looked at the screen, his face contorted with anger. "Do you think this will save you?" His voice was almost a whisper, but there was a threat in it. "It's already saved me," she replied. "It's not just my story now." The second officer grabbed his arm, his voice low, almost panicked. "We need to leave. This could be a trap." The first one didn't listen. His eyes were glued to the screen. Then he looked at her, his gaze full of hatred. "You don't understand what you just did," he said, his voice growing menacing. "You think you can fight us? You think anyone will listen to you?" "They're already listening," she replied, her voice firm. His face turned pale, then flushed. He was about to explode, but the second officer intervened again. "Let's go," he shouted. "We've done enough already." They turned and walked away, their footsteps fading into the distance. The girl was left alone, her breathing heavy, but she stood firm. Her body was shaking from the cold and pain, but she knew that a turning point had just occurred. She looked at the phone they had thrown to the ground. The screen was broken, but the recording was still playing. She picked it up, her hands shaking, but her eyes were bright. She knew it wasn't over. They would come back, but now she was ready. Now she knew she could fight. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a cold, sticky air that seemed to freeze the streets. The silence was deceptive, like the calm before a storm. The girl clutched her broken phone, her wet hair plastered to her face, her heart a mixture of fear and determination. She knew this wasn't the end, and she was right. The sound of footsteps behind her made her freeze. It was too familiar, a slow, steady rhythm, as if each step was calculated to pierce her consciousness like a nail. She turned and saw them again. Policemen, their silhouettes seemed enormous in the light of the lantern, their faces masks of hatred. "You thought you could just sign us up and leave," the first one began, his voice low, like an ominous whisper. "Do you really think that would change anything?" She didn't answer. Her gaze darted between them, trying to find a way out, but the street was empty. No one, just her and these two, whose eyes looked at her with disdain. "Look at her," the second one chuckled, his voice mocking, as if he were talking about an object rather than a person. "She thinks she's important. You think this is your place," the first one continued, his steps getting closer, and she felt her body tense. "Here, among us, you will always remain a guest who was not invited." Her breathing became ragged, but she did not lower her gaze. "You have no voice, no right," said the second, stepping around her and standing behind her. Now she could feel them close in the circle. "You people like you always try to claim more than you deserve. And you know what's funny?" The first officer leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "We let you be here, like us, hauled this world up on our shoulders, and you, like you, just destroy it. Her eyes filled with tears, but she gritted her teeth. She couldn't afford to be weak. She knew it would be a victory for them. You can't even protect yourself, he continued, reaching for her prosthetic. What is this anyway? A cheap knockoff. Even nature refused to make you whole. Her body tensed. The words hit harder than she could have imagined. Let me go, she said, her voice hoarse but firm. Let go. The second laughed, his laughter echoing across the empty street. You don't understand anything. You're not here because you deserve to be free. You're here because we let you. The first officer straightened up, his gaze full of contempt. You'll never be one of us, he said, taking a step back. No matter how much you fight, you'll always stay where you are, down below. She squeezed the phone in her hand, feeling its sharp edges sticking into her skin. I'm not going to stay down there, she said, her voice shaking but determined. You dare threaten us? The first officer stepped forward, his face contorted with anger. It's not a threat, she replied, her eyes flashing with pent-up emotion. It's a promise. There was a moment of silence. The police looked at her, their faces expressing a mixture of anger and surprise. You regret this, the first one finally said, his voice quiet but full of menace. They turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of the wet street. Her body was shaking, her heart was pounding, but she knew she had made the right choice. She looked at the phone in her hand. It was shattered, but it was still recording. She turned it off, knowing she had more than fear now. She had a voice, and she intended to use it. The streets were silent as night fell, broken only by the occasional noise of passing cars and the raindrops that still trickled down the sidewalks. The girl stood alone, her legs shaking, but not from the cold. A hurricane of emotions raged inside her: anger, fear, pain, and a strange sense of pride that she hadn't broken down. She clutched the broken phone in her hand as if it were her shield, her only defense against a world that considered her an enemy. But this world wasn't going to let her go so easily. She took a few steps forward, trying to walk straight, despite the throbbing pain in her arm and the weakness in her leg. Every step she took was painful, but she kept going. Her prosthetic squeaked on the wet pavement, but she ignored it. She knew she couldn't stop, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Suddenly she heard the sound of footsteps. They were slow but sure, echoing in the empty alley. Her heart sank. She didn't look back, but she knew it was them again. Are you going far? A rough voice came from behind her. She frowned. See, everything inside her screamed, run, but her legs refused to move. I asked where you were going, the voice continued. It was cold as a knife blade, and just as sharp. She turned slowly. The same two officers stood before her again. Their faces were hard, as if carved from stone, but in their eyes there was malice, which was the most frightening thing of all. You think we're just going to let this go? The first officer stepped closer, his boots squelching loudly in the puddle. You think you can play with us? She clenched her fists. Her breathing became ragged, but she did not answer. You don't even know where you are, he continued, his voice even lower, ominously quiet. These are our streets, our city, and you are nobody? Nobody, the second repeated, his voice mocking. You're not even part of this world. You're just a stain on it. Her eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. She knew that tears would only increase their joy. Have you ever stopped to think about why you're here? The first one asked, his tone almost philosophical, making his words sting even more. You don't belong here. People like you shouldn't be here. You're pathetic, the second added, circling her like a predator circling its prey. You think your life matters? No one, do you hear me? No one will take your side. You're wrong, she finally said, her voice shaking but determined. Not right. The first officers laughed, but there was more malice in his laughter than joy. We are right. We are the law. And you are not even a man. The words cut through her like a knife. She knew they hated her for daring to stand up to them, for the color of her skin, for her weakness, but she couldn't let them win. Do you think you can decide who is human and who is not? She asked, her voice as hard as steel. Of course, the first officers replied, his eyes flashing with anger. And you'll always be on the bottom. We'll make sure of that. She couldn't listen to them any longer. She felt anger flaring up inside her, but that anger was her strength. You're afraid, she said, her voice quiet but confident. What did you say? The second officer stopped, his face tense. You are afraid of me, she repeated, You are afraid that I am stronger than you think. The first officer stepped closer, his face an inch from hers. We are not afraid of you, he hissed. We will destroy you. Her heart was pounding, but she didn't back down. Try it, she replied. And then, around the corner, other figures appeared. Headlights illuminated the street, and the officers frowned. A car pulled up, and another cop got out. It was Captain Harris, her father. The officers turned pale. Their faces, which a few moments ago had been filled with anger and confidence, were now distorted with fear. What's going on here? Harris asked, his voice low but firm. The officers did not respond. They knew that their power was destroyed at that moment. She looked at them, her eyes full of pride. She knew this was just the beginning, but now she was not alone. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the wet asphalt and the figures of the police officers, whose faces suddenly lost their former confidence. A man in uniform, tall and confident, stepped out of the patrol car. His silhouette immediately filled the street with tension. It was Captain Harris, a man whose reputation was known far beyond the precinct. His strict but fair approach made him a figure respected, even by those who disagreed with him. But for these two, his appearance meant only one thing: trouble. The girl looked at him, her wet hair still stuck to her face, but a spark of hope appeared in her eyes. This was her father, the one who always told her to fight for her place in the world, no matter how cruel it was. What's going on here? His voice was even, but there was a threat in it. The first officer took a step back, his eyes darting as if he were looking for a way out. The second stood motionless, his face pale. Sir, this is a misunderstanding. The first one began, his voice shaking. We were just checking her. Checked. Harris narrowed his eyes, his gaze landing on his daughter, whose face was smeared with dirt, her hand still clutching the broken phone. Checked, leaving bruises and dirt. He took a step forward, and both officers reflexively retreated. I want to hear everything, Harris continued, his voice as sharp as a blow. And not just from you. The girl took a deep breath. Her body was still shaking, but she found the strength to speak. They threatened me, she began, her voice weak but firm. They insulted me because of the color of my skin. They tried to show me that I was nothing. Harris frowned, his face cold as granite. He looked at the officers, his gaze piercing like a knife. Is it true? His voice was quiet, but there was a threat in that silence that made them both tense. No, sir, the second officer said quickly. She's exaggerating. We were just doing our job. Doing your job? Harris leaned closer, his face inches from the first officer's. Tell me how exactly your job involved threats and humiliation. The first officer tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Harris sat up and looked at the shattered phone the girl was holding. Is it written down? He asked. She nodded, and his face grew even more serious. He held out his hand, and she handed him the phone. Harris started recording, and as the officers' voices came through the speaker, the silence on the street grew louder. People like you. You will always be at the bottom. You are nothing. Their words echoed in the night, and with each passing moment, the policemen's faces grew whiter. When the recording ended, Harris looked at them, his gaze cold as ice. You just signed your own death warrant, he said quietly. I'm filing a report tomorrow morning. You're facing an internal investigation, and if this recording is passed on, which I certainly will, you're looking at more than just being fired. The first officers tried to object. Sir, it was taken out of context. Context? Harris interrupted, his voice rising. The context is to officers who think their badges give them the right to humiliate people. He turned to his daughter. Are you okay? He asked, his voice softer. She nodded, tears filling her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. Harris turned back to the officers. Leave, immediately, and pray that the consequences for you are limited to this investigation. They turned slowly and walked away, their steps heavy and uneven. The girl watched them go, feeling the tension leave her body. You were strong, Harris said, placing his hand on her shoulder. I'm proud of you. This night seemed to last forever, but now everything has changed. Her story was just beginning, but she already knew that she would no longer be alone in this fight. This world was not yet fair, but today justice took its first step. The officers walked away across the wet asphalt, but their steps, usually confident and loud, were now hesitant and uneven. They exchanged brief glances, as if trying to find in each other support that no longer existed. The first officers, who had recently looked at the girl with disdain, now felt his own confidence slipping away, leaving only cold fear in its wake. "It's just a misunderstanding," he muttered, more to himself than to his partner. "They won't do anything. We'll find a way to explain." But his voice was shaking, and his partner noticed it. "Did you see his face?" the second officer said quietly, his eyes wide with panic. "Harris isn't kidding. He's going to crush us." The first one stopped, turning to his partner. His face was pale, and his gaze darted around like a cornered animal. "We'll figure something out," he said, but it sounded more like a plea than a statement. "We have connections. They can't just ruin everything because of her. Because of her." The second officer chuckled, but there was no joy in his voice. "You heard the recording. Everyone will hear it now. We are doomed." The words were like a blow. The first officer felt panic tightening in his chest. He remembered how confident he had been a few minutes ago, how every word, every move he had made had been designed to humiliate her, to show his superiority. And now, all he saw were shattered fragments of his former glory. It just shouldn't have gone this far," he said, running a hand over his face, rain mixed with sweat on his forehead. "If she just shut up." But she didn't shut up, interrupted the second. "And now everything has changed." They walked to their car, but neither of them was in a hurry to get in. The silence between them was thick as fog, and both of them felt its weight. "Do you know what will happen next?" the second officer finally asked. "When this tape gets to the committee, we'll be fired. That's the bare minimum. What if it goes further, to court? What if we get sued?" The first officer exhaled slowly, his hands clenching into fists. "No one will take her side," he said, but his words sounded less and less convincing. "She's alone. We're officers. Do you believe it yourself?" The second looked at him with obvious doubt. "Harris is already with her. What if there is someone else after her? We thought for too long that we could get away with it." The words cut through the first officer's like a cold knife. He had always believed in his own immunity. The uniform, the badge, the wrinkle of that was not just trappings for him, but weapons. But now, on this night, he began to understand that this power could disappear as quickly as it had appeared. He looked at the wet street, where the lonely figure of the girl was still visible. She no longer looked weak. Her back was straight, and even from a distance he could feel that she was no longer afraid. "What have we done?" he muttered, almost in a whisper. The partner didn't answer. They both knew the answer, but words weren't necessary. As they climbed into the car, the first officer felt his body tense with fear. Questions, judgment, possibly a trial awaited them. But worst of all, he knew he could no longer hide behind a badge. His face, his name, would now become a symbol of hatred and injustice. He started the engine, but his hands were shaking. The car started, but something inside him broke. He knew that this night would change everything, and no matter what he did, there would be no turning back. His world, where he had always been on top, collapsed, leaving only emptiness and fear of inevitable punishment. The day began gray, as if the sky itself did not want to bear witness to what was about to happen. Officer crossed Saturday in his house, his hands shaking as he clutched a cold cup of coffee. His phone on the table flickered with notifications, but he did not dare pick it up. Every message, every missed notification could be the beginning of his end. Last night was still haunting him. Captain Harris's words echoed in his head like hammer blows. "You have sealed your doom." He tried to convince himself that it could still be fixed, that this was just a temporary setback. But the truth was clear. His world was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do about it. The doorbell rang, startling him out of his thoughts. He flinched, the cup slipping from his hands and smashing on the floor. The sound of the shattering glass echoed around the room like an omen. He approached the door slowly, his steps heavy, as if every part of his body was resisting. "Who's there?" he asked, trying to keep his voice firm. "This is the head of the Human Resources Department," a voice said. His heart sank. He knew what this meant. When he opened the door, a man in a formal suit stood on the threshold with a folder in his hands. His face was impassive, but his eyes were full of condemnation. "Officer Cross," he began, "you're being called to the station. Captain Harris and the Internal Affairs Committee are waiting for you today." His voice trembled, although he tried to hide it. Immediately, the man replied, his gaze cold. Cross nodded, but inside he was seething. He knew this wasn't just a disciplinary hearing. This was payback. When he entered the station, he was greeted by a deathly silence. The colleagues who had always greeted him before now avoided his gaze. They turned away, as if his presence was something dirty, something that could tarnish their reputations. He was led into a room where Captain Harris sat at a table with the commission representatives next to him. On the table lay the note the girl had made and several printed documents. "Sit down, Cross," Harris said, his voice cold and hard. Cross sat up, feeling sweat trickle down his back. His hands were shaking, but he tried to hold on. "Do you know why you are here?" asked one of the commission members, looking at him intently. I believe it has to do with the incident yesterday," he replied, trying to speak calmly. "An incident?" Harris leaned forward, his face cold. "You call deliberate humiliation and threats an incident." Cross tried to object. "It's all a misunderstanding. I was just trying to—" "Enough," Harris interrupted, his voice cutting through the ear like a knife. "We all heard the tape. These aren't just words. These are actions that go against everything we stand for." Cross felt his confidence finally evaporate. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, looking down. "You didn't want to." Harris slammed the table, making Cross flinch. "You thought you could use your power to humiliate people and get away with it." The silence in the room was deafening. Every eye was on Cross, and it felt as if he was on trial before the entire world. "Your behavior is unacceptable," said one of the commission members. "You are suspended from service with immediate effect. Your case will be referred to the prosecutor's office." Cross couldn't believe his ears. He wanted to object, but the words stuck in his throat. "You had a choice," Harris added, "but you made it. Now you must bear the consequences." After the hearing, Cross walked out of the station feeling the cold air hit him in the face. His world, which he had thought unshakable, had collapsed overnight. But that was just the beginning. The next day, the story hit the news. The girl gave an interview where she talked about her experience and how she found the strength to fight. Her words became a spark that ignited an entire movement. People who had previously been silent began to speak out. Her story became a symbol of the fight for justice. For Cross, this was the greatest punishment. He could no longer hide. His name became synonymous with injustice, and even outside the precinct, he was known as a man who abused his power. Now he was alone, isolated, in his own fear, and he knew this wasn't just the end of his career. It was the end of his old life. Cross Saturday in his dark apartment. All the curtains were drawn, as if he was trying to hide from a world that no longer accepted him. His phone was lying on the table, littered with notifications, but he didn't dare pick it up. Every message, every piece of news was another blow to his already ruined life. He knew that there was no way to get it back. Everything he had once considered unshakable, the respect of his colleagues, his status in society, his sense of self-importance had disappeared, leaving only emptiness. His name was now on every TV channel, not as a symbol of strength, but as a warning. People discussed his actions with condemnation, and his face became a symbol of abuse of power. Meanwhile, across town, a girl Saturday in a small room with bright lights from cameras. A journalist stood in front of her, asking questions with genuine interest. Her story had gone viral, spreading across social media, and now she was not just a victim, but a voice for those who had been silent for too long. "Do you feel like a winner in this situation?" the journalist asked, leaning closer. She thought about it. Her gaze slid over the wet glass of the window, where it was raining, reminding her of that night. "This isn't a victory," she finally answered. "This is just the beginning. What happened to me happens to other people every day, but I'm not afraid anymore. And if my story can change something, then it was worth it." Those words were soon quoted everywhere. People began sharing their stories, and hers became a catalyst for change. Protests began. The world, which had long turned a blind eye to such things, now began to see them differently. Cross saw it all. He saw footage of the rallies, photos of people holding signs with his name and the words, "Justice must prevail." He tried to justify his actions, but with each passing day, he realized that his actions weren't just a mistake. They were part of a system that was breaking people. One evening, when the whole city seemed to be plunged into silence, the doorbell rang. He opened it and frowned. A girl stood on the threshold. She was wearing the same black coat as that night, but now her gaze was firm, and in her hands she held a folder with documents. "Why are you here?" His voice was weak, almost a whisper. "I didn't come to blame," she said. Her voice was even, but there was strength in it. I came to remind you that you can make the right choice. The right choice, Cross laughed, but there was desperation in his laughter. You think that's possible after everything that happened? Yes, she said, her gaze as piercing as a blade. Admit your mistakes. Don't hide behind excuses. Be part of the change. He looked at her, and for the first time in all this time, his gaze was not full of malice or fear. There was only fatigue. He nodded, but said nothing. Weeks passed. At the public hearing where Cross's case was considered, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Journalists, activists, ordinary citizens all gathered to see how this story would end. When Cross took the podium, the room went silent. He looked exhausted, his face was pale, but in his eyes there was a spark of something no one expected to see, genuine remorse. I'm not here to defend myself, he began, his voice echoing around the room. I'm here to admit that I was part of the problem. I have used my power. I didn't just break the law. I violated the very essence of what it means to be an officer. His words caused surprise. A whisper was heard in the hall, but he continued. I know that an apology is not enough, but I am ready to cooperate with those who fight for change. I want to help fix what I destroyed. These words did not restore his respect, but they were the beginning of his redemption. People saw that this was not just an act of desperation, but an attempt to do something right. After the hearing, the girl approached him. This is just the first step, she said. I know, he replied. Her story and actions became an inspiration to thousands of people, and his confession showed that even those who are wrong can change their ways. This night, which began with hatred and fear, became a symbol of the change that had been long awaited. The world they lived in was still far from perfect, but now there was a little more truth, justice, and hope. Friends, this story touched us deeply and made us think about many important things. How did it affect you? Write in the comments what you think about what happened. Have you ever encountered injustice or racism in your life? Your stories are very important to us. Every comment helps us better understand how we can support each other and contribute to the fight for justice. We appreciate each and every one of you and are grateful that you take the time to be with us. If you enjoyed this story or want to see more like it, please support us with a like and a subscription. It helps our channel grow and spread important messages. We wish you peace, goodness, and a good day.